Betty Mae Harrison's weathered hand froze on the tranquilizer rifle, her 72-year-old heart hammering against her ribs as she stared down the barrel at her own son. Director William Thompson stood 20 feet away, his federal badge gleaming in the Montana morning sun, flanked by armed wildlife officers whose weapons were trained on the massive black bear behind her. This wasn't supposed to be a family reunion. Jake Wilson's radio crackled and hit the ground, his young face draining of color as the standoff registered. The cave entrance echoed with the desperate hissing of 4 baby pythons clinging to their adoptive mother, a 400-pound bear who had chosen love over every law of nature. Betty's mind flashed to the empty dinner table she'd set for 2 every night for 15 years, always hoping Billy would come home. Now he was here, and she was about to lose everything again. "Stand down, ma'am." Bill's voice cracked with authority that couldn't quite mask the pain. "This is federal business. How had saving a mother's love become a crime punishable by death? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story." Betty Mae Harrison had never imagined her golden years would be spent cleaning bear wounds and bottle-feeding orphaned pythons, but then again, life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. At 72, she lived alone in the weathered farmhouse that had housed 3 generations of Harrisons, nestled against the rolling foothills of Glacier National Park in Montana. The silence that filled those rooms wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that screamed with memories of children's laughter and a husband's gentle snoring, all of it stolen by time and stubbornness. Earl had been gone 3 years now, took his last breath, holding her hand while she whispered promises about keeping the bird feeders full and the porch light on. She'd kept both promises religiously, along with setting 2 plates at the dinner table every evening before quietly putting one away. The extra plate wasn't for Earl. It was for Billy, her only surviving child, who'd stopped being her son the day he walked out 15 years ago over what he called her bleeding heart foolishness. "You can't save every broken thing in the world, Mama," he'd shouted that terrible December morning, his bags already packed. "And I'm tired of watching you try." The fight had started over her volunteering at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center again, missing his college graduation ceremony to bottle feed an orphaned fawn. She'd explained that the fawn would die without constant care, but Billy had heard only that she'd chosen animals over him. Again. Now she survived on $2,200 a month from Social Security and the $50,000 she'd scraped together over 40 years of $20 bills hidden in coffee cans. The money was supposed to be for emergencies, though Betty had learned that at her age, every day qualified as an emergency of one sort or another. She spent her mornings feeding the stray cats that gathered on her porch, her afternoons volunteering at the local wildlife center, and her evenings writing letters to Billy that she never sent. The farmhouse felt bigger every year, like it was slowly swallowing her whole. She'd raised 5 babies in these rooms, buried 4 of them before they could give her grandchildren to spoil. Billy was all she had left, and she'd lost him too, not to death but to something worse, indifference. He'd even changed his last name to Thompson, erasing the Harrison legacy with paperwork and spite. Betty's only companions now were the rescued animals that found their way to her door, and Jake Wilson, the young park ranger who checked on her weekly and never minded when she talked his ear off about everything and nothing. She'd catch herself counting the seasons not by months but by migrations. When the geese headed south, when the bears emerged from hibernation, when the wildflowers painted the meadows purple and gold. But this morning, something different was stirring in the forest, something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about family, sacrifice, and the lengths a mother's heart could stretch. Betty's morning coffee turned cold in her hands as the sounds of struggle echoed through the pine trees behind her property. It wasn't the usual forest noise, not the territorial squabble of raccoons or the warning calls of startled deer. This was something primal, desperate, the kind of sound that made every maternal instinct she'd ever possessed rise up like hackles on a dog's neck. She grabbed Earl's old binoculars from the kitchen windowsill and stepped onto the back porch, her arthritic knees protesting the sudden movement. Through the morning mist, she could make out shapes writhing near the limestone cave system that bordered her land. Her breath caught in her throat as the scene came into focus. A massive black bear, easily 400 pounds, locked in what appeared to be a death struggle with the largest snake she'd ever seen outside of a nature documentary. "Lord have mercy," Betty whispered, already reaching for her phone to call Jake Wilson. The python, and it was definitely a python, even she could tell that much, had to be 18 feet long, its golden brown coils wrapped around the bear's torso like some ancient nightmare come to life. The bear's powerful jaws were clamped down on the serpent's head, but with each labored breath she took, those muscular coils tightened like a living tourniquet. Jake answered on the second ring, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning, Miss Betty. Everything all right?" "Jake, honey, I need you to get over here right now. Bring your tranquilizer gun and maybe call for backup. There's a situation." 20 minutes felt like 20 hours, but Jake's Park Service truck finally came rumbling up her gravel drive, followed by a second vehicle carrying Dr. Sarah Kim from the university. Betty had met the wildlife biologist before at community meetings, a serious young woman who talked about animal behavior like other people discussed the weather. "What are we dealing with, Miss Betty?" Jake asked, already checking his tranquilizer rifle as they approached the tree line. "Big black bear tangled up with a python the size of a telephone pole," Betty replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Been going at it for near an hour now. That bear's getting tired." Dr. Kim raised her binoculars and let out a low whistle. "Burmese python, adult male, probably around 200 pounds. What the hell is it doing in Montana?" They moved carefully through the Douglas fir and western hemlock, staying downwind from the struggling animals. As they got closer, Betty could see the bear's dark fur was matted with blood from dozens of puncture wounds where the python's needle-sharp teeth had found purchase. The bear's eyes, intelligent, desperate, met Betty's for a brief moment, and she could have sworn she saw recognition there, as if the animal understood they were there to help. Jake took careful aim and fired. The dart struck the python behind its diamond-shaped head, and the snake's grip loosened just enough for the bear to slash at its body with claws that left deep furrows in the thick scales. Dr. Kim fired a second dart, and within minutes that felt like centuries, the python's coils went slack. The massive snake was dead by the time they reached it, probably from internal injuries sustained during the prolonged struggle. The bear stood on shaking legs, breathing hard, her sides heaving with exhaustion. Betty expected her to flee into the forest. Any wild animal should run after such trauma. Instead, the bear did something that made all three humans freeze in place. She turned toward the limestone cave entrance and released a series of low, guttural calls that Betty had never heard from a black bear in all her years around wildlife. The sounds were almost conversational, like a mother calling her children to dinner. The response came from deep within the cave, a chorus of high-pitched hissing that definitely wasn't the cry of bear cubs. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, his rifle still ready. "Are those snakes?" From the shadows of the cave emerged 4 young pythons, each about 3 feet long, moving with the distinctive serpentine flow Betty recognized from nature documentaries. They slithered directly toward the wounded bear, who lowered her massive head to nuzzle each one with remarkable gentleness. Dr. Kim was already pulling out her camera, her scientific training overriding her shock. "This is impossible. Cross-species adoption between mammals and reptiles? The biological imperatives are completely contradictory." Betty watched in stunned silence as the bear examined each snake with the same careful attention she would give her own biological offspring, sniffing for injuries, gently licking their scales clean, positioning herself protectively between them and the human observers. The smallest python, noticeably thinner than its siblings, showed clear signs of malnutrition and old scarring along its body. "That little one's been hurt," Betty observed, her nurse's training kicking in. "Look how careful she is with it." As if responding to Betty's comment, the bear gently nudged the weakest python toward what appeared to be a cache of fresh fish near the cave entrance. The little snake fed eagerly while its unlikely mother stood guard, ears constantly swiveling to monitor for threats. "Jake," Betty said quietly, "I think we just witnessed something that's never been documented before." The first hint that their extraordinary discovery would become a bureaucratic nightmare came in the form of Jake's crackling radio. Dr. Kim had been documenting the unprecedented interspecies family for barely 3 hours when headquarters demanded a full report on the python situation. "Mandatory reporting for invasive species," Jake explained apologetically to Betty as he keyed his radio. "Federal law requires immediate notification when Burmese pythons are found outside their designated range." Betty felt her stomach drop. She'd seen enough wildlife management in her 72 years to know that invasive species was usually a death sentence wrapped in bureaucratic language. "Jake, honey, what exactly does that mean for our little family here?" "Standard protocol is removal and euthanization," Dr. Kim said quietly, still filming the bear as she groomed one of the python babies. "Burmese pythons are considered an ecological threat. They've devastated native populations in Florida." "But these are babies," Betty protested, watching the smallest python curl trustingly around the bear's massive paw. "And they're orphans. Look how that mama bear loves them." Jake's face was grim as he finished his radio call. "Federal teams being dispatched from Denver. We've got maybe 48 hours before they arrive." Betty spent that first evening sitting vigil near the cave entrance, her folding lawn chair positioned where she could observe the remarkable family without disturbing them. The bear, Betty had started thinking of her as Dolly, after her own grandmother who'd raised half the orphans in their county, seemed to accept her presence with remarkable calm. As darkness fell, Betty watched Dolly carefully arrange her adopted children for sleep, her massive body creating a living fortress around the young pythons. The bear systematically checked on each snake, gently nudging those that seemed restless, making soft vocalizations that the pythons appeared to respond to with subtle movements of their own. "She's counting them," Betty whispered into her phone to Jake. "Every night, making sure all 4 are accounted for." The recognition hit her like a physical blow. This was exactly what she'd done when her own children were small, the nightly rounds, the gentle touches to sleeping foreheads, the counting that never ended even when they grew up and moved away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She'd lost 4 of them, and now she was watching another mother who might lose her babies to forces beyond her control. When Jake arrived the next morning with coffee and day-old donuts from the town's only bakery, he found Betty hunched over a stack of yellowed papers from a cardboard box she'd retrieved from her attic. "Miss Betty, you been up all night?" "Found something, Jake." "Something that changes everything." Her hands trembled as she held up a faded research document marked with official government seals. "Project Wildlife Adaptation, 1983. I was the nurse assigned to care for research animals." Jake squinted at the bureaucratic language. "What kind of research?" Betty's voice broke as the memories came flooding back. "They were studying stress adaptation in orphaned wildlife. Bears, mostly. Young cubs separated from their mothers to see how they'd cope." She pointed to a photograph paper-clipped to one of the reports. A tiny black bear cub with a distinctive D-shaped marking being cut into her forehead for identification purposes. "Research subject D47, Betty read aloud. "Female black bear, approximately 6 months old, parents killed by poachers, assigned to handler 23. She looked up at Jake with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Handler 23 was me, honey. I took care of that baby." The photograph showed a much younger Betty in a nurse's uniform, bottle-feeding the small bear cub. The same D-shaped scar was clearly visible on Dolly's forehead. "My God," Jake breathed. "You think this is the same bear?" "I know it is. I'd recognize that marking anywhere. I watched them cut it into her little head." Betty's voice carried 40 years of suppressed guilt. "We told ourselves we were helping them, but we were just another kind of people taking babies away from where they belonged." Jake studied the documents with growing alarm. "Miss Betty, if this is true, if Dolly was part of some government research program, that might explain why she's so comfortable with humans, but it also means when they separated her from her family, they damaged her in ways we're just now understanding," Betty finished. "That's why she can love those snake babies. She knows what it feels like to lose everything." The sound of diesel engines echoing through the forest cut their conversation short. A convoy of federal vehicles was making its way up the mountain road, their official plates and government markings unmistakable even from a distance. "They're early," Jake said, checking his watch. 12 hours early." Betty stood up slowly, her arthritic joints protesting, but her resolve crystallizing into something harder than Montana granite. "Jake, I need you to do me a favor." "Anything, Miss Betty." "I need you to call that environmental lawyer in Missoula, the one who fought the mining company last year. Tell him I've got $50,000 and a story that'll make his career." She folded the research documents carefully and tucked them into her jacket pocket. "And then I need you to help me get between those federal boys and our family up there." As the government vehicles drew closer, Betty looked up at the cave where Dolly was already positioning herself protectively in front of her adopted children. The bear seemed to sense the approaching threat, her dark eyes fixed on the convoy with an intelligence that went far beyond animal instinct. "Don't you worry, sweetheart," Betty whispered. "This old nurse isn't going to let anyone separate a family again, not on my watch." The man who stepped out of the lead federal vehicle moved with the rigid precision of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions about animals. Tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors, he carried himself like a soldier reporting for duty. His name tag read Director W. Thompson, and when he spoke, his voice carried the flat authority of bureaucratic certainty. Betty felt something cold twist in her stomach as she watched him approach. There was something familiar about the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the unconscious gesture of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking. But it couldn't be. Billy had been gone for 15 years, and this man was all sharp edges and federal authority. "Dr. Kim, I presume?" Director Thompson addressed the wildlife biologist with professional courtesy. "I'm Director William Thompson, National Invasive Species Response Team." "I understand you've been documenting an unauthorized python population." "That's correct, Director," Dr. Kim replied, her camera still recording. "But this isn't a typical invasive species situation. We're dealing with documented cross-species adoption between a black bear and orphaned Burmese pythons. The behavioral implications are unprecedented." Director Thompson's expression didn't change. "The behavioral implications are irrelevant to ecosystem protection, Doctor. Burmese pythons represent a Category 1 ecological threat. Standard protocol requires immediate removal and humane euthanization." Betty stepped forward, her hands shaking with more than just age. "Director Thompson, if I may, ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is federal business. These animals pose a significant threat to native wildlife populations." His voice was professional, distant, but something flickered in his eyes when he looked at her. "I've seen what happens when invasive pythons establish breeding populations. The ecological damage is irreversible." "But these aren't wild pythons," Betty pressed, her voice growing stronger. They're orphans being cared for by a mother bear. That has to count for something. Sentiment doesn't override scientific protocol, ma'am. Director Thompson turned to his team, already pulling out containment equipment. We'll proceed with standard removal procedures. The bear will be relocated to a suitable habitat where she can contribute to the native population. Jake Wilson stepped up beside Betty, his young face flushed with indignation. Director, with respect, this bear has formed genuine emotional bonds with these snakes. Separating them could cause severe psychological trauma. Animals don't form emotional bonds across species lines, Thompson replied curtly. What you're interpreting as affection is simply modified predatory behavior. That's when Betty's world tilted on its axis. The phrase, "animals don't form emotional bonds," was delivered with the exact same dismissive tone Billy had used 15 years ago when he'd accused her of projecting human emotions onto wildlife. The gesture that followed, the unconscious way he touched his left temple when frustrated, was pure Billy Harrison. "My God," Betty whispered, her hand flying to her chest. "Billy! Billy! Is that you?" Director Thompson froze mid-sentence, his professional composure cracking for just an instant. When he turned to face her fully, Betty could see past the federal authority and weathered features to the little boy who used to climb into her lap during thunderstorms. "It's Director Thompson, ma'am," he said carefully, but his voice had lost its edge. "I believe you're mistaken." "William Thompson," Betty said slowly, the pieces clicking into place. "You changed your name. You dropped Harrison." Her voice broke on the last word. "Oh, Billy, my Billy." The federal team continued their preparations around them, but the world had narrowed to just Betty and the son she'd lost to pride and stubbornness. Jake and Dr. Kim watched the reunion with growing understanding, while Dolly emerged from the cave entrance, her 4 adopted children pressed close against her sides. "Mom!" The word escaped him like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. "What are you doing here?" "I live here, honey. This is my land." Betty took a tentative step toward him, afraid he might disappear again if she moved too quickly. "I've been writing you letters for 15 years. Never sent them, but I wrote them." Bill's professional mask was crumbling. I thought you'd forgotten about me. Moved on to your next rescue project." "Forgotten?" Betty's laugh was half-sob. "Billy, I set a place for you at dinner every night for 15 years. Every single night. I kept your room exactly the way you left it." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You were never a project, honey. You were my heart walking around outside my body." Dr. Kim cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should give you two some privacy?" "No," Bill said firmly, his federal training reasserting itself. "This doesn't change the situation. The pythons still need to be removed." But his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes kept drifting to Dolly and her unusual family. Betty saw her opening. "Billy, look at them. Really, look. That mama bear chose to love those babies even though every instinct should tell her they're prey. She's teaching them, protecting them, counting them every night to make sure they're safe." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Just like I did with you." "It's not the same thing, Mom. They're different species." "So what?" Betty's voice gained strength. "Love doesn't ask for permission, Billy. It just shows up when something needs protecting." She gestured toward Dolly, who was gently grooming the smallest python with her massive tongue. "That bear lost her own cubs. I found their remains in the cave. She was grieving, just like I grieved every day you were gone." Bill stared at the interspecies family, his internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. "The protocol exists for a reason, Mom. Invasive species cause ecological disasters. I've seen entire ecosystems collapse because someone made an exception for emotional reasons. And what about when the protocol is wrong? Betty challenged. What about when following rules means destroying something beautiful and irreplaceable? Dr. Kim stepped forward with her camera. Director Thompson, I've been documenting this relationship for 2 days. This bear has modified her entire behavioral pattern to care for these pythons. She's hunting for them, regulating their body temperature, teaching them cooperative feeding strategies. This isn't modified predatory behavior, this is genuine parenting. The data is unprecedented, Jake added. This could revolutionize our understanding of animal consciousness and emotional capacity. Bill watched as Dolly noticed the federal containment equipment and immediately positioned herself between the humans and her adopted children. Her vocalizations took on a distinctly distressed quality, and the pythons responded by pressing closer to her, seeking comfort from their unlikely mother. They know what's happening, Betty said quietly. Look at her, Billy. She's terrified of losing her babies, just like any mother would be. Bill's radio crackled to life. Director Thompson, headquarters is requesting an ETA on the removal operation. He stared at the radio for a long moment before responding. Tell headquarters we're encountering complications that require additional assessment time. Sir, our orders were for immediate extraction. I'm well aware of our orders, Bill snapped. I'm also the senior field director, and I'm making a tactical decision to ensure proper documentation before proceeding. He turned off the radio and looked at his mother. You've got 24 hours, Mom. That's all I can give you. Betty felt hope bloom in her chest like wildflowers after rain. 24 hours to do what? To prove that love really can overcome protocol, Bill said quietly. Because if you can't, I'll have to follow through with the removal. And that will destroy both of us all over again. As the federal team set up their temporary camp, Betty looked up at Dolly and her adopted family. The bear seemed to sense that she'd won a reprieve, but her protective stance never wavered. The smallest python, the one that had been injured when they found the family, wrapped itself gently around Dolly's paw in a gesture of trust that transcended species. Don't you worry, sweetheart, Betty whispered to the bear. This old nurse has learned a thing or two about fighting for family, and I'm not giving up on any of us. 24 hours felt like both a lifetime and a heartbeat as Betty marshaled every resource she could think of to save Dolly's family. By dawn, her kitchen table was covered with legal documents. Her phone had been ringing non-stop, and Jake Wilson looked like he hadn't slept in a week. The environmental lawyer will be here by noon, Jake reported, gulping his 4th cup of coffee. Margaret Chen from Missoula. She says she's never handled an interspecies custody case before, but she's willing to try. Betty nodded grimly as she folded her mortgage papers. At 72 years old, she was betting her home and life savings on a bear and 4 baby snakes. Earl would have called her 7 kinds of crazy, but Earl had also been the man who once drove 300 miles to reunite a lost dog with its family. What about the petition? She asked Dr. Kim, who was hunched over her laptop at the kitchen counter. Over 50,000 signatures and climbing, Doctor. Kim replied, her eyes bright with excitement. The hashtag #SaveDolly'sBabies is trending nationally. We've got support from wildlife biologists, animal behaviorists, and conservation groups across the country. But it was the local support that truly amazed Betty. Cars had been pulling up to her property all morning, neighbors she barely knew bringing coffee and sandwiches, teenagers with smartphones documenting everything for social media, and elderly folks who remembered when communities rallied around their own. Martha Billings from the post office arrived with a box full of mail. These came addressed to the Bear Lady, she explained. Letters from all over the country. People sending donations, sharing their own stories about unusual animal families. Betty opened one envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a child's drawing of a large bear hugging several snakes, along with a crayon-scrawled note. "Dear Bear Mama, please don't let the government men take your snake babies. Love, Emma, age 7. "Lord have mercy," Betty whispered, her eyes filling with tears. By mid-morning, a small army of protesters had gathered along the mountain road leading to her property. They carried signs reading, "Love has no species," and "Families belong together." Local news crews were setting up equipment, and Betty could see satellite trucks from regional television stations parked along the highway. Bill watched the growing crowd from the federal command post with increasing unease. His radio crackled constantly with calls from his superiors in Washington demanding updates and expressing frustration with the delay. "Director Thompson," his lead agent approached cautiously. "Headquarters is asking for your direct report on the situation status." Bill studied the protesters, many of whom were elderly like his mother, their weathered faces set with the same stubborn determination he remembered from his childhood. "Tell them we're conducting thorough environmental impact assessments to ensure proper protocol compliance." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The truth was that Bill had spent the night sitting in his government SUV, staring at old photographs he'd carried in his wallet for 15 years. Pictures of his mother bandaging the wing of an injured owl, bottle-feeding an orphaned deer, staying up all night with a sick raccoon kit. He'd told himself for years that her bleeding heart was weakness, but watching Dolly risk everything to protect her adopted children had forced him to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe his mother's greatest strength had always been her refusal to let protocol override compassion. The breakthrough came just after lunch, when Dr. Kim made a discovery that changed everything. "Bill, you need to see this," she called from her laptop, where she'd been analyzing the DNA samples she'd collected from the python family. The results just came back from the university lab. Bill approached warily, his mother and Jake flanking him on either side. "The 3 larger pythons are full siblings, as expected," Dr. Kim explained, pointing to the genetic analysis on her screen. "But the smallest one, the injured one that Dolly has been giving special care to, it's not a pure Burmese python." Betty leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "It's a hybrid, part Burmese python, part boa constrictor. Genetically impossible to occur naturally in the wild, which means—" Dr. Kim paused dramatically. "It's not technically classified as an invasive species under current federal guidelines." Bill stared at the data, his mind racing through the legal implications. "You're certain about this?" 100%. The hybrid classification creates a legal loophole. Technically, we can only remove documented invasive species. A hybrid that doesn't exist in nature falls into a regulatory gray area that would require congressional review to resolve. Jake let out a whoop of excitement. "That could buy us months of legal delays!" But Dr. Kim wasn't finished. "There's more. I cross-referenced these DNA results with a federal database of research animals, and I found something disturbing." She pulled up another screen showing government documents from the 1980s. Project Wildlife Adaptation wasn't just studying stress responses in orphaned animals. They were conducting unauthorized breeding experiments with exotic species. Betty felt the blood drain from her face. "What kind of experiments?" "Cross-breeding programs to create animals that could adapt to climate change." The project was shut down in 1987 after an environmental scandal, but apparently some of the hybrid animals were never properly contained. Dr. Kim looked directly at Bill. "Your government created this problem 40 years ago and then covered it up." The silence that followed was broken by Bill's radio. "Director Thompson, this is Assistant Director Morrison from Washington. We need your immediate status report." Bill looked at his mother, at Dolly protectively grooming her hybrid child, at the crowd of supporters gathered to defend an impossible family. When he keyed his radio, his voice was steady and clear. Assistant Director Morrison, this is Thompson. I'm suspending removal operations pending investigation of potential federal liability issues related to historical research programs. Director Thompson, you don't have authority to... Bill turned off his radio and removed the battery. There, he said quietly. That should buy us some time. Betty stared at her son in amazement. Billy, you could lose your job over this. Maybe, Bill admitted. But I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about love not asking for permission. He gestured toward Dolly, who was patiently teaching the hybrid python how to position itself for optimal fish catching. That bear didn't check with Federal Wildlife Management before she decided to love those babies. Maybe it's time I stopped checking with headquarters before I decided to love my family. As the afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, Betty reached out and took her son's hand for the first time in 15 years. His fingers were calloused from years of outdoor work, but they felt exactly the same as when he was 5 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. Whatever happens next, Betty said softly, we face it together. All of us. That's what families do. Up at the cave entrance, Dolly seemed to sense the shift in the human's energy. For the first time since the federal agents arrived, she relaxed her protective stance and allowed the hybrid python to venture a few feet from her side to investigate a colorful wildflower growing near the rocks. Love, it seemed, was finally winning. The call from Washington came at 4:47 a.m., shattering the fragile peace that had settled over Betty's property. Bill's emergency phone buzzed with the harsh insistence of federal authority, and even before he answered, Betty knew their reprieve was over. Director Thompson. Assistant Director Morrison's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. You have exactly 1 hour to complete the removal operation or face immediate suspension and federal charges for obstruction of environmental protection protocols. Bill sat on Betty's front porch steps, still in yesterday's clothes, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold while his career crumbled around him. Sir, the legal complications I mentioned have been reviewed and dismissed by the Attorney General's office. Hybrid or not, those animals pose an unacceptable risk to native ecosystems. Morrison's tone brooked no argument. 60 minutes, Thompson. Complete the mission or face court-martial. Betty appeared in the doorway behind him, her hair still in curlers, clutching a cup of coffee like a lifeline. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. They're really going to do it, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Bill nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of inevitable defeat. Federal marshals are already en route as backup. If I don't comply, they'll arrest me and complete the removal anyway. Up at the cave, Dolly seemed to sense the approaching doom. Her protective vocalizations had grown increasingly agitated throughout the night, and the 4 python babies stayed pressed close against her massive form. The smallest one, the hybrid that had given them hope, remained wrapped around her paw like a living bracelet, as if it understood that love might not be enough to keep them together. By the time the sun fully crested the mountains, federal marshals had joined Bill's original team, their black tactical gear and emotionless efficiency turning the peaceful forest into something that felt like a military operation. Protesters still lined the road, but their earlier enthusiasm had given way to grim determination as they realized they were witnessing the final act of a tragedy. Margaret Chen, the environmental lawyer Betty had mortgaged her house to hire, stood beside her client with tears streaming down her professional composure. I'm sorry, Betty. I've exhausted every legal avenue. The federal courts won't grant an emergency injunction without more time to review the case, and time is the one thing we don't have. Betty watched the tactical team deploy their containment equipment, specialized nets, tranquilizer guns, reinforced transport cages designed to separate families and break hearts with bureaucratic efficiency. Jake Wilson stood beside her, his young face twisted with the kind of helpless rage that comes from watching injustice unfold with legal precision. "There has to be something we can do," Jake said desperately. "Some last-minute appeal, some—" "No, honey," Betty interrupted gently. "Sometimes you fight as hard as you can, and you still lose. That's not the family's fault, and it's not ours either. Sometimes the system is just bigger than the love trying to work within it." Dr. Kim approached with her camera equipment, her scientific objectivity finally cracking under the weight of what she was documenting. "Betty, I want you to know that this footage will change everything. Even if we can't save Dolly's family today, the research implications will revolutionize how we understand animal consciousness. Their sacrifice won't be in vain." "Their sacrifice," Betty repeated bitterly. "They shouldn't have to sacrifice anything. They should just get to be a family." Bill appeared beside the tactical team, his federal badge restored to its position of authority, his face a mask of professional duty that couldn't quite hide the son's heartbreaking underneath. When he spoke into his radio, coordinating the final phase of the operation, his voice carried the hollow tone of a man performing his own execution. "All units, begin containment procedures. Priority is animal safety during extraction." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. They were prioritizing animal safety while destroying an animal family. Dolly emerged from the cave as the team approached, her 4 adopted children arranged behind her in the defensive formation they'd practiced countless times over the months they'd been together. She looked directly at Betty, and in that moment of eye contact, Betty saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The bear understood exactly what was about to happen, and she was asking for help that Betty couldn't give. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Betty whispered, her voice carrying on the mountain air. "I'm so sorry." The first tranquilizer dart struck Dolly in the shoulder, and she staggered but remained standing, her massive form still shielding the python babies. The second dart brought her to her knees, and as consciousness faded from her dark eyes, her last act was to try to gather her children closer with weakening paws. The smallest python, the hybrid that had caused such legal hope, refused to leave her side even as the containment team approached. It coiled itself around Dolly's unconscious paw one final time, a gesture of loyalty that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Betty collapsed onto her porch steps as her heart shattered completely, wondering how love could be so powerful and so powerless at the same time. The containment operation proceeded with the cold efficiency of a military extraction. Betty watched through tears as federal agents loaded the unconscious Dolly into a specialized transport vehicle, her massive form strapped down with industrial restraints that made her look like some kind of dangerous criminal rather than a grieving mother. The 4 python babies were placed in separate climate-controlled containers, their panicked hissing audible even through the reinforced glass. Bill supervised the operation with the hollow professionalism of a man performing his own soul's execution. Each barked command, each procedural check, drove the knife of duty deeper into the heart of the son who had finally found his way home, only to discover he'd arrived too late to save anything that mattered. "Transport 1, you're cleared for departure to the Colorado facility," Bill announced into his radio. "Transport 2 will follow with the reptile specimens." Betty flinched at the word specimens. 24 hours ago, they'd been a family. Now they were reduced to bureaucratic terminology that stripped away every ounce of love and connection they'd shared. Dr. Kim stood beside Betty, still filming, tears streaming down her face as she documented the destruction of something unprecedented and irreplaceable. "This is going to haunt the scientific community for decades," she whispered. "We're witnessing the government destroy the most important discovery in animal behavioral science since Jane Goodall's work with chimpanzees." The first transport truck rumbled to life, carrying Dolly away from the only family she'd known since losing her biological cubs. Through the reinforced windows, Betty could see the bear's unconscious form, and her heart broke all over again, knowing that when Dolly woke up, she would be alone in a sterile government facility, wondering what had happened to her children. Jake Wilson approached Bill with barely controlled fury. "Director Thompson, I want it on record that I believe this action constitutes a crime against nature and basic human decency." Bill's mask of professional composure finally cracked. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped. "You think I wanted this? That Bear raised those babies for 8 months and I just destroyed their family because some bureaucrat in Washington thinks protocol matters more than love?" "Then why didn't you stop it?" Jake shot back. "Because if I hadn't done it, federal marshals would have," Bill replied, his voice breaking. "At least this way I could ensure the animals weren't hurt during the extraction." "Sometimes you choose the least terrible option available, not the right one." Betty watched the second transport vehicle being loaded with the Python containers, each baby isolated from its siblings in sterile medical transport cases. The smallest one, the hybrid that had wrapped itself so trustingly around Dolly's paw, lay motionless in its container, and for a terrifying moment Betty thought it might have died from the trauma. "Is it alive?" she called out to the technician handling the container. The man checked his monitoring equipment. "Vital signs are stable, ma'am. It's just in shock from the separation." Shock from separation. Betty understood that feeling all too well. She'd been in shock from Billy's separation for 15 years. And now she was watching history repeat itself with a cruelty that felt almost cosmically unfair. As the second transport truck prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. Margaret Chen, the environmental lawyer, came running across the field from her car, waving a stack of papers and shouting for everyone to stop. "Federal injunction," she called out breathlessly. "Emergency stay granted by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals." Bill held up his hand, halting the convoy. "What kind of injunction?" Margaret caught her breath before speaking. "Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to your assistant director, has granted a temporary restraining order based on new evidence of federal misconduct in the original wildlife experiments." She held up the legal documents. "We have 72 hours to present a full case for permanent protection." Betty felt hope flicker in her chest like a candle in a storm. "What does that mean for Dolly and her babies?" "It means they can't be separated or relocated until the court makes a final determination," Margaret explained. "They have to be returned to their original habitat immediately." Bill stared at the legal papers as if they might disappear if he looked away. "I'll need confirmation from federal legal counsel before I can reverse a completed operation." "Already handled," Margaret smiled. "I've been on the phone with the Attorney General's office for the past hour. The injunction supersedes all previous orders." Dr. Kim was already running toward the transport vehicles. "We need to get them back together immediately. The psychological trauma from separation could cause permanent behavioral damage, especially to the hybrid." The next hour felt like watching a miracle unfold in reverse. Dolly was carefully unloaded from the first transport, still groggy from the tranquilizer but alert enough to recognize her surroundings. The Python containers were opened near the cave entrance, and one by one the babies slithered toward their adoptive mother with desperate urgency. The reunion was heartbreaking in its intensity. Dolly, still weak from the drugs, gathered each python close with trembling paws, counting them over and over. 1, 2, 3, 4. As if she couldn't quite believe they were real. The hybrid baby, the smallest and most vulnerable, wrapped itself around her paw in the exact same position it had occupied before the separation, and Dolly's soft vocalizations suggested relief so profound it transcended species. Betty knelt beside the reunited family, her own tears mixing with joy and exhaustion. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she whispered to Dolly. "I'm so sorry we let them take you apart." Bill approached cautiously, his federal authority temporarily suspended by the court order and his own emotional exhaustion. "Mom, what Margaret found, the evidence of federal misconduct, what exactly was it?" Margaret Chen smiled grimly. The 1980s research program wasn't just studying adaptation. They were deliberately releasing hybrid animals into various ecosystems to test survival rates. The government has been covering up an environmental experiment gone wrong for 40 years. Dolly's family isn't an anomaly. They're evidence of federal crimes. Betty looked up at her son, seeing past the director's badge to the little boy who used to cry when nature documentaries showed animals being separated from their families. "What happens now, Billy?" Bill knelt beside his mother, watching as Dolly gently groomed the hybrid python that had nearly died from their separation. "Now we fight. Not as Director Thompson following federal protocol, but as Billy Harrison protecting the family that raised him to understand that love doesn't recognize boundaries." As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of hope and redemption, the Impossible family settled back into their cave. They had survived separation, federal intervention, and the cold machinery of bureaucracy. But the real test, proving that love could triumph over law, was just beginning. 1 year later, Betty Mae Harrison sat in her favorite rocking chair on the porch of her new cabin, watching the morning sun paint golden stripes across Dolly's Grove Wildlife Preserve. At 73, she moved a little slower than she used to, but her eyes sparkled with the contentment of a woman who had witnessed love triumph over law and lived to tell about it. The legal battle had taken 8 months, countless court appearances, and a congressional hearing that made national headlines. Margaret Chen had proven that the federal government's 1980s wildlife experiments had illegally introduced hybrid species into 17 different ecosystems across the western United States. The resulting settlement, $2.3 million in damages, had funded the establishment of Dolly's Grove, a research facility dedicated to studying interspecies relationships and providing sanctuary for animals whose families defied conventional wisdom. "Morning, Mom," Bill called out as he approached the cabin, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and a folder full of the day's paperwork. At 49, he looked younger than he had during his federal years, as if stepping away from bureaucracy had lifted a weight from his shoulders that had been pressing down for decades. Betty accepted her coffee gratefully, noting how her son's hands were calloused now from building enclosures and repairing fences rather than shuffling government documents. "How are our extended families doing today?" Bill settled into the chair beside her, opening his folder with the practiced efficiency of a man who had found his true calling. "Dolly's doing beautifully. Doctor, Kim thinks she might be pregnant. We're seeing all the behavioral indicators of a bear preparing for cubs." Betty's heart swelled with joy. "Real cubs this time?" "Real cubs," Bill confirmed. "But here's the amazing part. She's already started modifying her den to accommodate both her biological offspring and her adopted python family. She's creating separate temperature zones within the cave system." They watched as Dolly emerged from the limestone cave entrance, followed by her 4 python children, now fully grown but still maintaining their bond with their unusual mother. The hybrid, whom Betty had named Hope, had grown into a magnificent serpent with the distinctive markings of both parent species, living proof that nature's boundaries were more flexible than any government manual suggested. "Dr. Kim says Hope is showing maternal behaviors too," Bill continued, referring to his notes. "She's been caring for a clutch of eggs we found abandoned near the thermal springs. Even Jake thinks she might successfully raise them." Jake Wilson appeared as if summoned by the mention of his name, his park ranger uniform traded for the practical work clothes of a wildlife sanctuary manager. At 30, he had the lean build and weathered confidence of someone who spent his days working with animals rather than tourists, and his devotion to Dolly's unconventional family had never wavered. "Miss Betty, you need to see this," Jake said excitedly, pulling out his phone to show them a video. "Watch what happens when Dolly counts her family now." The footage showed Dolly's evening routine, carefully touching each of her python children with her nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. But then continuing to a fifth spot near her den entrance, where she'd been preparing a nursery area. She vocalized softly to the empty space, as if practicing conversations with cubs that hadn't been born yet. "She's already making room in her heart," Betty observed, wiping away tears. That bear understands that families grow and love multiplies rather than divides. The preservation of Dolly's family had sparked a revolution in wildlife management policies across the country. The documented evidence of interspecies emotional bonding had forced federal agencies to revise their protocols, requiring psychological impact assessments before separating any animals showing signs of adoptive relationships. Betty received letters daily from families who had been inspired by their story, couples who had adopted children across racial lines, families who had welcomed elderly relatives into their homes, communities that had opened their doors to refugees. "Mrs. Harrison?" A young voice interrupted Betty's reverie. She looked up to see Emma Patterson, age 8 now, approaching with her grandmother, Carol. Emma was the child who had sent the crayon drawing of Dolly hugging her snake babies, and she had become one of the preserve's most devoted visitors. "Hello there, sweetheart," Betty smiled, noting how Emma clutched a new drawing in her small hands. "What have you brought me today?" Emma shyly held up her artwork, a more sophisticated rendering than her first attempt, showing Dolly surrounded by both python babies and bear cubs. "I drew her whole family," Emma explained. "The babies she chose and the babies she's going to have." Carol Patterson smiled at Betty with the understanding that passed between grandmothers. "Emma's been saving her allowance to donate to the preserve. She says Dolly taught her that families come in all different shapes." As the Patterson family toured the visitor center, Betty reflected on the ripple effects of one bear's extraordinary love. The preserve welcomed over 50,000 visitors annually, many of them children who left with a fundamentally altered understanding of what family could mean. School groups came from across the region to learn about interspecies relationships, and several universities had established research partnerships to study the unique dynamics of Dolly's extended family. But the most meaningful change had been in Betty's own life. Bill had moved back to Montana permanently, taking early retirement from federal service to manage the preserve. They had dinner together every evening, making up for 15 years of empty chairs and unspoken words. His own children, Betty's grandchildren, visited regularly, and the farmhouse that had echoed with loneliness now rang with the voices of 3 generations learning to be family again. "You know what I've learned this past year?" Betty asked Bill as they watched Dolly teach Hope how to hunt fish in the shallow stream that ran through their territory. "What's that, Mom?" "Love doesn't just save the ones being loved, it saves the ones doing the loving too." Betty reached over and squeezed her son's hand. "Dolly didn't just rescue those python babies. They rescued her from grief, just like you rescued me from loneliness by coming home." Bill squeezed back, his eyes fixed on the impossible family that had brought them back together. "I spent 15 years following protocols that protected ecosystems while ignoring the ecosystem that mattered most: our family." As the sun climbed higher over the Montana mountains, painting the preserve in shades of gold and green, Dolly settled beside the stream with her python children arranged around her like a living constellation of love. In a few months, bear cubs would join this extraordinary family circle, and the preserve would witness something that had never been documented in the history of wildlife research: a mother raising both her biological and adopted offspring together in perfect harmony. Betty rocked gently in her chair, her heart full of gratitude for the bear who had taught them all that family isn't about biology. It's about showing up every single day with a love big enough to embrace whoever needs it most. At 72, Betty Mae Harrison thought her days of building family were over. Her husband was gone, her son had been estranged for 15 years, and her farmhouse echoed with the silence of missed opportunities. But when she discovered Dolly, a mother bear who had adopted 4 orphaned baby pythons, Betty found herself fighting not just for an impossible animal family, but for the chance to rebuild her own broken relationships. Against federal protocols, bureaucratic coldness, and her son Billy, who had become the very government official tasked with separating families, Betty risked everything she had. Her life savings, her home, even her health, all to prove that love doesn't ask for permission. It just shows up when something needs protecting. What started as saving a bear's adopted babies became a journey of healing that brought 3 generations back together. Today, Dolly's Grove Wildlife Preserve stands as proof that it's never too late to choose love over law, family over protocol, and hope over heartbreak. Sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones we choose, fight for, and refuse to give up on, no matter how impossible they seem. Questions for you to consider. Have you ever had to choose between following rules and following your heart? What would you risk to bring your family back together? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone who needs to hear it today.